On this Tuesday night, Hockey Canada executives get defensive.
To scapegoat hockey as a centerpiece for toxic culture is, in my opinion, counterproductive.
The grilling they got over secret slush funds to settle sex abuse lawsuits.
The players walked away with no consequences.
Calls grow louder for a civilian disaster response force instead of relying on the Canadian military. Standing up for women's rights and against Iran's regime.
A revolution is unfolding.
The movement is gaining momentum. Where is it headed? And she was a coal miner's daughter and the queen of country music. The legacy of the legendary Loretta Lynn.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin tonight with Hockey Canada, an organization that was already under intense scrutiny for its handling of multiple sexual assault allegations. Today, the scrutiny got even more intense. MPs of all political stripes grilled the senior leadership team at Hockey Canada about using non-disclosure agreements to silence abuse victims and secret slush funds to settle multi-million-dollar lawsuits.
Hockey Canada is saying, we'll pay, we'll make it go away, and the players can just continue, and no one will ever hear any further details. Do you understand why it looks to the general public like Hockey Canada is condoning that behavior?
I understand there is a perspective out there, and I do, with great respect, disagree with it. We decided to resolve the matter in a way that was trauma-centered, victim-centered, or complainant-centered, and at the same time, we've got an investigation that's ongoing.
It was combative, it was tense. The executives repeatedly defended their record and said nothing needs to change. Abigail Bimman has our top story tonight.
Our board does not share the view that Hockey Canada should be making more leadership changes at this time.
From the opening statement through 2 hours of testimony, defense, defense, defense.
Scapegoat hockey as a centerpiece for toxic culture is, in my opinion, counterproductive to
Scapegoat, the organization at the center of criticism over its handling of sexual assault, particularly allegations of group sex assault by some players in 2018, tried to paint itself as the victim.
Substantial misinformation and unduly cynical attacks. Hockey Canada has an excellent reputation. I do not fault senior management or the board with respect to the way the 2018 sexual assault incident was handled.
It's important not to be tone deaf.
In a deeply politicized committee climate, all political parties were on the same page.
The answers have just not been forthcoming, and the transparency has not been present.
And you have said, no, we are going to protect the leader, we are going to keep the leader, and somehow magically still change culture. Is that correct?
No, I'm sorry. Respectfully, I disagree with that.
The Globe and Mail reported there was a second undisclosed fund to cover sexual assault claims and other lawsuits paid by player registration fees. While the interim chair referenced misinformation, she didn't explain the contradictions.
That it's inaccurate to say that the Participants Legacy Trust Fund was used to settle sexual assault claims.
They're saying also that it's not used for sexual assault, but it says it in the very wording of his affidavit that this is one of the purposes of the fund. So I don't think she acquitted herself very well on that one.
The organization's federal funding frozen. The Minister of Sport says the government will look as far back as 2016 to make sure no public funds were used in the settlement.
At this point, with the current leadership, I don't have hope that they have the capacity to renew themselves from within.
She's calling on provincial voting members of Hockey Canada to push for change at the top. Abigail Bimman, Global News, Ottawa.
In the United States, members of the women's national soccer team are demanding immediate changes after a scathing report detailed systemic verbal, emotional, and sexual misconduct within the country's top women's soccer league. The highly anticipated report found the abuse and misconduct spanned multiple teams, coaches, and victims. It also details what it calls a deeper culture in women's soccer, including youth leagues, that normalizes abuse and blurs the boundaries between coaches and players. A lengthy list of recommendations include making the public aware of suspended individuals and raises the question of disciplining team owners. For the third straight year, participation has given Canadian kids a failing grade for overall physical activity, screen time, and sleep habits. In its latest report, the organization says already low activity levels for kids and teens plunged even further, largely because of public health restrictions. Physical activity went from a D+ in 2020 to a D this year. And while screen time grades dropped from a D to an F, participation does say that's worrisome, but expects those grades to rise now that pandemic restrictions are lifted. In Atlantic Canada, the Prime Minister backed up last week's promise to help people recover from Hurricane Fiona. Justin Trudeau was in Nova Scotia today announcing hundreds of millions of dollars in aid. Ross Lord reports.
For the second time since Fiona devastated Atlantic Canada, the Prime Minister is promising government assistance with rebuilding.
The federal government is announcing the new $300 million Hurricane Fiona Recovery Fund.
Prime Minister Trudeau says the money will be used for things like repairing fishing wharves and getting damaged businesses back on their feet. The Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency will administer the program, although some details are still being finalized.
With respect to the criteria as well, we still have some details that need to be worked out, but I can tell you that the money is going to be rolling out very quickly because we recognize that there are serious needs on the ground and we want to be there for Canadians.
The government says the fund is meant for people who are not covered by existing programs. What it can't do is restore power to people who've been without it for day after day after day.
You feel cut off, you feel lonely.
Bob Bentley is on day 11 in the dark, along with thousands of other PEI residents.
No internet, no TV, no freezer, no cooking. It's been rough. We'd rather have some semblance of order.
It's unclear how or if they'd qualify for assistance under the new federal fund.
There was this one right here, my house.
As for people who are uninsured or underinsured, like many in the Port aux Basques, Newfoundland area whose homes were destroyed, the government promises they won't be forgotten, a commitment welcomed by the town's mayor.
There was a fear on the days when all this was going, will I be left out? It's not that I wouldn't carry insurance. I just had to make a choice between insurance or putting food on the table for my children.
Are you tracking like the G and the H?
The Prime Minister insists the money will not be bogged down in bureaucracy because the growing frequency of natural disasters has forced the government to become much better at rolling out assistance. Ross Lord, Global News, Halifax.
The head of the Canadian Red Cross says the country needs to be better prepared for natural disasters and can't only rely on the military. Testifying on Parliament Hill, Conrad Sauvé says climate-related disasters are becoming more common and emergency response operations are placing an increasing strain on governments, the military, and groups like the Red Cross. Sauvé recommends the creation of a civilian disaster response force.
And while the Canadian Armed Forces have always been there to help in times of disaster, they must remain the force of last resort and should not be the only permanent national surge capacity in times of emergencies.
There are more than 700 Canadian military personnel in Atlantic Canada helping with the cleanup from Hurricane Fiona, but thousands of customers are still without power. In Florida, more than 1,500 American Red Cross volunteers are working around the clock to help people in the aftermath of Hurricane Ian. Emergency aid centers are in full swing. People are lining up for food and other basics. It's been nearly a week since the Category 4 storm obliterated thousands of homes and businesses in Florida. At least 106 people are now confirmed to have died, and more than 2,000 people have been rescued. The search, though, is still going on, as Jackson Proskow reports.
So much of Florida is unrecognizable, like coastal Sanibel Island, completely cut off from the mainland. Hundreds of people rode out the storm here. 500 have since been airlifted to safety. Lacey McClary recorded the storm as it tore through her home on the island.
I thought we need to make peace. This may be the time, but God, please just save all of us.
On nearby Pine Island, the storm surge took what the wind didn't. Residents are only now finding their way to safety.
It was a nightmare, really. I don't know how we survived. I didn't think we were.
Statewide, there's a desperate rush to rescue people and distribute supplies. as search and rescue crews continue to comb through shattered homes and endless debris.
Lifting up houses, lifting up rubble, listening, sending dogs in. So what they're trying to do is to find the survivors.
There are also growing questions about whether mandatory evacuation orders came too late. Many residents stayed put, believing earlier forecasts that Ian would strike further north.
We got that message out at the right time. Now, whether people listen to it, we can't force people out of their homes.
This generational disaster may be among the deadliest and most expensive in Florida history.
We lost everything.
Amidst the ruins of shattered lives, there are people who still refuse to leave. After losing everything they own, they can't bear the thought of losing the place they call home. Jackson Proskow, Global News.
Quebec Premier François Legault got back to work today after winning an even bigger majority in last night's provincial election. The CAQ won easily in rural and suburban ridings, but was unable to connect with many diverse voters in Montreal. Legault says his focus is on protecting the French language and that he won't reopen the discussion over electoral reform. Mounting defiance coming up. Protests against the Iranian regime are massive. What difference will they make? Protests against the regime in Iran continue in that country despite a brutal crackdown, and they're gaining momentum in other countries too, including Canada. The death of Mahsa Amini last month has set off a powerful movement against the oppressive regime in Tehran, but past protests have ended with no change. Heather Yurix West looks at what people are hoping for this time.
The chaotic scenes of violence and terror are difficult to watch.
There are countless people dead. There's countless examples of them being taken away with bags over their heads. And God knows what's going to happen to these kids.
Young people protesting Iran's government have become targets in recent days. Rights groups estimate more than 130 people have died as the country tries to gain control of a protest movement that just continues to grow. It was 2.5 weeks ago that the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini sparked a collective rage towards Iran's regime. But just as they've done in the past, Iran's leaders have responded with brutality.
Just 2 days ago, security forces surrounded Iran's leading university, basically locking students down on campus, and then arrested students while also shooting live ammunition.
Canada announced new sanctions against Iran Monday with the promise of more action to come. Several European countries are pushing the EU to do the same.
I am obviously worried, deeply worried about my own family members, about people from my country of birth. But at the same time, there is a certain degree of exhilaration at the idea that these protests are gaining momentum and that a revolution is unfolding.
Buoyed by the support of Iran's diaspora worldwide, in Canada, rallies have drawn tens of thousands to the streets, standing in solidarity with those who continue to put their lives on the line, who after 40 years of oppression are now refusing to back down. Heather Yurix West, Global News, Calgary.
The U.S. and South Korea have fired 4 ground-to-ground missiles during joint military drills, a response to North Korea launching a ballistic missile over Japanese territory. Japan briefly activated its emergency alert system when the missile flew over Hokkaido. It ended up landing in the sea. North Korea last fired a missile over Japan 5 years ago, but has upped its missile testing recently in response, it says, to the drills being carried out by the U.S. and South Korea. Japan calls the latest missile launch a threat to regional security. Ukrainian forces are making rapid progress on 2 fronts, recapturing territory in the country's south and northeast. Those advances follow the recapture of a key rail hub of Lyman on Saturday. Ukrainian soldiers now taking stock of a large number of Russian vehicles and ammunition that was left behind by the retreating Russian forces. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the Ukrainian flag is now flying again over hundreds of communities in the Donbass, Donetsk, and Kharkiv regions. At the same time, the first Russian troops called up during the recent mobilization have begun arriving in Ukraine after just a handful of days of training. The European Union is moving ahead with plans to standardize all phone chargers. The new rule is a world first. It will introduce a single USB charging point for mobile phones, tablets, cameras, and other devices by 2024. The measure is expected to affect iPhone maker Apple more than its rivals. EU lawmakers overwhelmingly approved the change. It was prompted by complaints from iPhone and Android users about having to switch to different chargers for their devices. Forgotten tragedies ahead, the grim reminder of the thousands of Indigenous women who never came home. Three years after the release of the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, groups from all across the country say not enough is being done to prevent further tragedies. In Toronto, a huge and heartbreaking newspaper called Cover Stories tells the individual stories of 4,000 mothers, daughters, and sisters who never came home. As Neethu Garcha reports, the size of that newspaper is meant to be shocking and to put the focus on the ongoing lack of action to protect Indigenous women and girls.
Each woman deserved their own cover story.
Meant to finally give them the attention warranted, this newspaper featuring 4,000 cover stories honors the lives of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people.
We also wanted to define the magnitude in the physical paper itself. The paper weighs about 25 pounds, and that really demonstrates that if you capture the true story of each Indigenous woman who has been missing or murdered, you would see the heaviness of it.
The stories compiled by the Native Women's Resource Centre of Toronto. Executive Director Pamela Hart hand-delivered this massive symbol meant to spur national action to the Prime Minister's office in Ottawa.
To remind him that action needs to happen quicker and swifter. We know that the number is larger than the 4,000, but we're using the 4,000 because we want to bring it back to the action called in the inquiry report.
Advocates say a roadmap on what to do already exists through those 231 calls for justice in the National Inquiry report, which found violence against this demographic amounts to genocide. Efforts to heal, raise awareness, and fight for justice with marches and vigils on this National Day of Action happening right across the country.
We're hoping to, keep it top of mind for folks as we kind of move through the process of truth and reconciliation. There's always more that we can do.
Canadian white women generally ignore us, so that's why it perpetuates. They would rather have their own voice over our voice. And I mean, the foundation to the women's rights to vote was done on the back of a Métis woman right here in Calgary.
Many say police are apathetic towards these cases and discriminate against them, forcing victims' families to conduct their own independent investigations into the murders of their loved ones. Assistant Professor Dr. Krista Stelkaya says specific recommendations relating to policing need to be acted on.
Often times police come out and kind of start to blame the lifestyle of victims as opposed to looking at them like they are victims of violence, and police really need to start to interrogate those notions within their force.
Back in Toronto, a commemoration for the lives lost, part of an ongoing call to action being led by those most affected by the very disappearances they're trying to bring to light. Neethu Garcha, Global News.
Farewell to the Queen of Country. Next, a look at Loretta Lynn's legacy. It would take too long to list all the awards and accolades Loretta Lynn won over her trailblazing career. She topped the country music charts 16 times, a singer and songwriter who got her start as a young woman and never stopped. Lynn died peacefully in her sleep today at the age of 90. As Eric Sorensen reports, the music world is paying heartfelt tribute to one of the most beloved country stars in history.
Well, I was born a coal miner's daughter.
She really was a coal miner's daughter from the hills of Kentucky, but she sang about stories that struck a chord with country music fans for more than 50 years, often the hardships women faced with their men.
And don't come home but drinking with loving on your mind.
She married at 15, had 6 children, with a husband who at times abused alcohol and her.
I think it's just everyday living. I mean, I had to live my songs to write them.
It'll be over my dead body.
Loretta Lynn's own heartaches made her music more relatable.
Although you ain't woman enough to take my man.
Her autobiography, The Coal Miner's Daughter, inspired the Academy Award-winning film.
Woman, if you want to keep that arm, you better get it off my husband.
An unvarnished tale of how her husband's behavior was the source of many of her songs, but the man she called Du pushed her to sing, managed her career, and they never split up.
What'd you get me a guitar for?
Because I like the way you sing.
He said, you're going to be a singer, and I sang. And I made it. I couldn't let him down.
This old maternity dress I've got.
Loretta Lynn sang about birth control and divorce, digging deep into hard subjects that were banned by some radio stations till their popularity won out.
When it hit the charts, they had to take it out of being banned and play it, you know. Everybody had to play it when it was on the charts.
Dolly Parton posted, "She had millions of fans, and I'm one of them. I miss her dearly." Miranda Lambert wrote, "She blazed so many trails for all us girls in country music." And from Carole King, she was an inspiration.
Loretta
Lynn was the first woman ever to win the Country Music Association's Entertainer of the Year. Later, she was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And when she won a Lifetime Achievement Award, Garth Brooks gave her a lift.
I said, "You want me to pick you up in a limo or the truck?" She goes, "Bring the truck, darling." That was it.
She sang with country icons like Conway Twitty, and later in life collaborated with a new generation of singers like Jack White. Loretta Lynn will be remembered as a no-nonsense storyteller and a resilient star from humble beginnings.
Except the memories of the coal miner's daughter.
And tonight's Here Canada is a little-known fact about Loretta Lynn. She got her start in a Vancouver neighborhood. In the 1950s, a backyard chicken coop stood on this site. It was a popular venue for local musicians at the time. A young Loretta Lynn visited in 1959. That plaque is to commemorate that day. She performed in front of some record label executives. They were impressed, they signed her, and the following year released Lynn's first single, I'm a Honky Tonk Girl, which she re-recorded for her final 2021 album. That's Global National for this Tuesday. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow.